So welcome everyone to the Halton County Radial Railway virtual book chat. As far as I know, I think this is the first one we've ever done, so I'm really excited that you could join us for that. My name is Caroline Rose. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm the Secretary and Director of the OERHA, and I'm also the project lead and editor of the museum's 70th anniversary book, which I am excited to say will be out very, very soon. I'm really looking forward to everyone seeing this book. It's been a long time coming. With me is Robert Lubinski, who is the president of the OERHA and author of the Toronto G Trains, which came out late last year. Also joining us is Trevor Parkins-Sciberras. I knew I'd mess that up. Social media manager for the museum and also a photographer and author of the Transit Time Warp series, which has 3 books so far and more to come. And also, I just want to do a shout out to Spencer, who will be administering tonight's event. So thank you, Spencer, for that. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. This is a webinar, so you won't have an opportunity to talk, and we can't see your lovely faces, unfortunately, but thank you very much for being here. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature probably at the bottom of your screen. Spencer and I will be monitoring it, and we'll answer questions in real time, or we might save them until the Q&A section at the end of the discussion. The agenda for tonight is we'll be, as I said, having a discussion, just talking about our projects and things to come for about approximately an hour. We'll see how that goes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So with that, we'll get started. So thank you, Rob and Trevor, for being here and agreeing to do this. I was really pleased that you accepted my invitation for this. So really excited to share your projects and what you've been working on and what is to come. So just to start, just talking a little bit about inspiration and the process of your project. So what inspired you to do your books? And I'll open it up to either one that wants to answer first.
Trevor, you start off.
Me? Okay.
Yeah,
Are we
why
gonna,
you
I
start
guess
off?
we'll do the same order. Yeah, so my love of photography is the main thing, and archival photographs on the internet. So the thing is, this Then and Now project I started for that my books are based on actually predates my love of transit history. So I know this is crazy. You guys know me. I love my transit history, but this started as my love of junction history because that's the neighborhood I grew up in Toronto. And so I started doing then and nows of the junction, just street scenes back in 2012. It was the changing landscape that actually caught my attention. And it wasn't until I discovered the Streetcar Museum, perhaps you guys have heard of it, in 2014. That's actually what got me into transit history. So again, I think it was just a love of my neighborhood and the changing landscape that really inspired me to get this series going. And I guess as I lived in Toronto, I was very much focused on the TTC. Everything was the TTC. But with time, I grew out of that, and now I'm very much trying to expand my coverage to more of Ontario. Lots of Ontario cities have transit history of their own. Our museum has artifacts from other Ontario cities. So yeah, that's what's really been driving me forward, is to just keep expanding this and covering more areas, covering more cities. I mean, the whole world, every city in the world has transit history. So I guess I have a long ways to go, but we'll get there.
So Rob, what about you? What inspired you?
Well, yeah, obviously, this is similar to Trevor growing up in Toronto, and as a kid going shopping downtown with my mom. She was a big shopper at the Simpsons main store at Yonge and Queen. So we take the subway from Greenwood Station to Yonge and Bloor, and then take the subway down to Queen Street. And every so often, you'd have the luck of catching one of the red Gloucester subway trains. And they made a lot of noise, and the lights blinked on and off, and they were bright red, and so naturally they kind of get your attention. And I really liked riding them, and I used to pester my mom on the way home if we could, wait another train to catch one of the red trains. Sometimes she'd be, yeah, okay, we'll wait another train, but other times, no, we got to go home. So just my love of these subway trains from my youth, from wanting to ride them. And of course, once I was able to ride the subway on my own, I didn't have to wait for someone else, get someone's okay to wait. I just went out kind of riding the subway on my own, and really enjoyed riding these trains. And of course, they retired in the late, starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and then they were gone. And I know about 10 years later, I was working with a colleague who was inspired to write a book, and he had watched the Calgary Olympics with his brother, and they were really excited about the Olympics, and they really got into it. And his brother ended up having, some health problems and ended up passing away. And as a tribute to his brother, my coworker wrote a book about Canadian Olympic athletes, as that had been in the Calgary Olympics and subsequently. And I thought, what? I thought, hey, if he's motivated to write a book about something he's really passionate about, I'm gonna try the same thing. So that's kind of what gave me the initial idea to actually start writing the book, and writing this history, because time had obviously had passed since then. This was like 2001, 2002. So it had already been more than 10 years since the G trains had retired. So I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to write the history of these trains.
Yeah, it looks like you're sitting in one now.
I wish.
Great background. Yeah. I think for me with the 70th book, it's as a personal thing, I've always wanted to do a book, just to see if I could do it, and turns out I can, so that's great. The other one was, it just seemed the 70th was a great opportunity to showcase the history of the museum. I mean, 70 years is pretty significant, and I thought, well, this is a good time to do that. So I'm really excited for everyone to see it, as I said before. So what was the process in developing your book? Like, what kind of research did you do? Did you do an outline? How did that work for both of you? Or how did you come up with your ideas and how to build this book?
Well, for me, it definitely started as a social media thing. So I was making these then and now comparisons to post on social media. It was the idea to make them into books that came later. And, I'm actually very happy now that I've transitioned over to books. And for the research, a lot of it had to do with online archives, like the Toronto archives. That was a huge one for me. So they do have a website. Now they also have, amazing building that you can go into and do research. But the fact that you can search on the internet to see a good idea of what the Toronto archives has, that's really helped with my research, because my whole project has been photography first. If there's no photos of it, I don't find it that interesting. It's got to be a photography thing. I mean, I love all this history, don't get me wrong, but for researching what I do, it's the photographs first. So where can I find those? Well, the Toronto Archives has a lot. But as I've progressed, I've met other photographers like myself, and even guys like Robert Sandusky shared a whole bunch of his stuff. Even like a couple of years ago, he was sending me stuff, but in the last year or so, I've been able to visit him and scan a few hundred of his photographs. So, I have so much material to work with now. It's been fantastic. So yeah, whatever resources I can dig up for photographs. Again, there's tons of history out there, but it's photography first for me. And even I do have a folder. I have multiple folders on my computer of to be matched, right? Because I'm doing then and nows. So here's all the ones I want to match. And as I work through them, I drop them into the folder where they've been matched. And sometimes I've been sorting them where I could do winter shots, where it's, photos that have snow in them. So that way, when we're stuck in the dead of winter and I can't really do too much, well, here's all these winter shots I can work on now. So keeping it organized like that has helped me a lot. Yeah, especially like the folder system on my computer has definitely improved over the years of keeping this stuff all organized. When I first got into this whole project, I just dropping them in the same, my pictures, and then everything's dumped in there, nothing's named properly. It was a disaster. I mean, it worked for me, but then with time, if I wanted to go back and find something, like, oh, wait, well, where did I put it? Oh no, everything's a mess here. So with time, I've really improved my organization on this, between the research and between keeping all my photos organized on my computer. That's helped a lot with this.
So just a question, you mentioned the Toronto Archives is a great resource. How do you find for other cities as well, like Hamilton and that? Do they have online resources, or do you physically have to go somewhere?
Now, there are other archives out there. Hamilton does have the Hamilton Public Library, the main branch, does have an archives on its top floor, which is very interesting to visit, and their website is very searchable. Now, I will say not all archives are that great or like not that accessible. And maybe that comes down to a budgetary thing. So it just from what I found so far, the Toronto archives is the most accessible, especially because of their website. Other cities have that, but I just feel like the further you get from Toronto, the less accessible it becomes. Maybe not quite so, but still, I just find, yeah, that some of them you do have to go into, and I do go into them because it's a fun adventure, and you never know. Like not everything is scanned on their website, anyways, including the Toronto archives. So your best bet is to go in person to see stuff that hasn't been scanned yet. So yeah, there's lots out there if you know where to look.
So Rob, what about you with your
Well, so
process?
well with the G Train book, I kind of there was kind of a the story to tell from how the conception, the development of the cars, and how they came to be, which is like a whole story in itself, and then kind of the life of the subway cars. I mean, they ran for 36 and a half years. They carried millions of people through daily lives, going to work, school, hockey games, sports, concert, like everything, like everybody's daily life. So there was kind of the story to tell of how they were developed, what was the conception of the how they actually like physically came to be, and then the kind of the story of their life as they ran, and as this the city really grew in that time between the 1950s and the 1980s, and really just kind of telling that story as this, the subway system grew and the city grew, and they kind of matured, and then as they got older, they were being replaced and retired, and they dwindled down, and that was the end of it. So that was kind of the overall arc, and that was kind of what I wanted to tell. That's very similar to like a lot of books about transit vehicles, streetcars, particularly a lot of books about streetcars, not just in Toronto, other cities, and other types of public transit, interurbans and radials and things. So there was kind of that basic format, but I also wanted to add like a little more like the local flavor of how the city evolved with the subway and how the city changed, and also just kind of to tell the story about how the cars were developed. So I really didn't have a lot of information on that part, because there were some pamphlets that kind of talked about here's the development of the subway cars, and there's very, very high level, very general. So I really want to find out what was, how did this actually all take place? So I started with like a 1-page, office notepad of, like 12 bullet points of, what was the order of the story that I wanted to tell initially. And and I kind of, that was, my first organization of thoughts. And then I kind of looked at it the next day and kind of expanded some, each bullet point into like 3 points. So I ended up with 2 sheets of paper, and then I redid it and I was into like 4. So it kind of fleshed out into what kind of, topics I want, what could be covered under each of the parts of the story. And that's kind of the outline that the book kind of carries through right to the finished product, as sort of, the development, the construction, the subway opening, the beginning, and then the life, and then the retirement and the end. So, and then recollections and things like that I thought would be good to add. So that's kind of what I start with. And in terms of starting, well, to look for information, as like Trevor said, the Toronto Archives, fantastic resource for photography, a lot of TTC information, a lot of like all the TTC Commission meeting minutes are available, publicly available. A lot of information in those meetings, because they talked about selecting the builder for the subway cars, like a lot of issues about the cars when they were new. So a lot of really good information and reports attached to. So there's a lot of like all the details were all like a lot of the detail was all in there. So it was then taking all this information and then kind of sorting it out and making it fit to where it went in the story. So and also like a lot of old magazines and journals from the time of when the subway opened. There was a lot of information. It was a big deal. So there's a lot of detail about the subway cars, about the subway. You don't really get that now because it's not a new subway line opening. I mean, when the Eglinton LRT finally opens, there probably won't be a big journal article of full technical detail about everything, because it's like, okay, it's another rapid transit line. So the thing with the early articles about subway, there's a lot of information. So it was good to find those newspaper articles, the TTC magazine, kind of like just going through and finding bits and pieces of information that would be useful and relevant, and then like fitting them in like puzzle pieces into where they fit into the story. So that's kind of the approach. And as I did this, it got bigger and bigger. And then I started actually writing, to make a story out of it. So it just kind of evolved. And then doing the photos at the end was kind of the fun part. At the end is, how do you to pick photographs that tell the story to go with all this. So that was kind of the process. It was just sort of a starting with the bullet points and fleshing it all out to the book that it finally became.
And Rob, you talked about too, you even went further back, like to England, but because that's where they were manufactured and that too. So you took it that little step further back, which is I found really interesting to do that as well. So
yeah, it would have been a fun trip to go to Gloucester, to the archives in Gloucestershire, where they actually have the archives of the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. But they were actually good enough to copy all the like a lot of the information from the original order books, like all handwritten, like these big, they're probably these big books. And it's all like handwritten in like fountain pen and like notes everywhere. And they actually sent me like big photocopy sheets of a lot of this information, which was like tremendously valuable. So I didn't get to go, but I got a lot of the information from them and photos as well. So that was great.
awesome. So Trevor, there's a question that's come in here for you. How do you scan the archives to add it to your book?
Well, with the Toronto archives, they email it to you. So if you find the photo on their website, you can pay them and they'll send you a high resolution copy of it. Now, that being said, I have gone to other people, including Robert Sandusky, right? I went to his place to scan the stuff. I've got a high resolution slide scanner. And actually, yeah, quite a few of the slides in my books are, sorry, I answered the thing. Quite a few of the photos in my books are slides I bought off eBay. So those I scan myself. I've got an Epson scanner here for that kind of thing. But then most archives, they'll email you the high resolution copy.
So what surprised you the most about your process, the research process? Is there something that you thought, might be easy to find, but didn't turn out to be easy to find? Or is there anything that kind of, I guess, the challenges that you came across too?
Well, for me, it was definitely the time and patience that was going to go into this. I think I vastly underestimated that. Once I started making books, I thought, oh yeah, I'll be able to pump these things out in no time, like especially in 2020, and the TTC's 100th anniversary was coming up in 2021. I thought, oh yeah, I'll be able to do a whole bunch of books in time for that. But then once I'm getting into working on them, I realized, oh, actually, this takes a lot of time, and then you got procrastination, and I think that's what surprised me the most, was just the amount of time this is going to take, and maybe even just the self-control of me telling people what I'm going to work on. Maybe that didn't help to hype this up. Oh yeah, I'm gonna making this book and it's gonna be like this. And then I realized that may have been stealing my motivation to actually work on the book. If I'm telling people what I'm working on, yeah, that kind of surprised me. I had to come and realize, you're better off working in secret and then reveal the final product than to tell people what you've been working on. So that was a good learning experience for me.
I think that's good advice. Rob, what about you? Any surprises or challenges?
Similar to Trevor at the time. So I remember there was the book that came out, I don't know how many years ago, and it was about Ottawa streetcars, big, thick, red book. And I think the original author had started, it passed away before it was published. And in the notes, it says that he'd worked on it for like 12 years. And I thought, 12 years he worked on this. Like, wow, how could it take him that long? And I work on my book. It took me 10. I thought, okay, that makes sense now, because it just takes you that long to be able to, obviously, because you're working and doing other things, and trying to do the book in sort of spare time, or when you can fit it in. But in terms of getting the information, going to get your get information, get the bits and pieces, kind of synthesize it all, and then write it up and edit it and retype it, and just trying to make it all flow. It is time consuming. It does take a lot of time to be able to take a quantity of information and then trying to sort of distill it down into what's important, what's not important, and then make it fit to tell the story that you're trying to tell. So that was another thing that surprised me as well, was just the amount of time it takes to do this kind of project.
I'd agree with that, with both of you on that. With mine too, like I didn't write it, I was compiling the information. But like I pitched the project in 2023 thinking, oh yeah, I'll have it done in time for the 70th anniversary in September. No problem. But so I kind of worked on it over the winter, like gathering the information. But what took me a really long time was photos, just tracking down the right photos, and some I just wasn't able to get in time. And then also I had to pull it back a bit because it was incredibly long. So, you know, I can't have everything in it. But anyway, I think what I ended up with is still tells a good story. But yeah, that definitely took me a lot longer than I thought it would. And then just kind of building, I guess, the outline of the book. I decided on 7 chapters, 10 years per chapter, sort of thing, to commemorate the 70 years. So anyway, so yeah, I would agree. Like, whatever time you think you need, it'll take you, like, double it, sort of thing. So yeah, if that's it. So if you have a deadline, just push the deadline right off the bat. Anyway, but it'll be worth it in the end. I have to agree. So I'm just going to move into sort of my next bit of questions, talking about themes. So what, like, obviously you had like a focus for the book where there's certain types of themes that you wanted to focus on. And then what was your favorite part of the book? Did it change as you were working on it, going, oh, I think I'm really going to love this part, but then you ended up, oh, you know what, I really loved how this turned out. So any feedback on that?
Well, for sure, like the theme of my books has been the then and now, the photographic comparisons. And so in my mind, it's always been, as I've mentioned before, photography first, but also just fun with photography. I never intended to have just pages and pages of texts in my book. I mean, that's what books are, is text. But to me, it was always going to be a photography series book, or book series now, as it's been. That every page should have at least one photograph on it. You know, that's something I kind of work towards. Again, the theme being photography. As for my favorite part of it, I mean, I really like, as I got into the second and third book, I started including like the abandoned right of ways. So even though all 3 books of mine have the then and now comparisons, I like the exploration aspect of it. And so just having pages of, well, here's the abandoned rail trails that you can visit now. And it's also because it's something I did. You know, I went to these spots, I took the photos. So it's my contribution to the niche. In fact, I can almost say my favorite part of my books is that they have so many of my photos in them. You know, like, of course, the archival photos will always be the more interesting ones, but I didn't take any of those. So the fact that I can publish books with my own photographs in them, you know, it's something I'm very proud of. And especially with stuff like rail trails, you know, I feel like I'm inspiring people that they can go see these spots for themselves. Here's some photos of them. You know, it makes me feel like I'm contributing something to the niche. You know, I'm not just publishing other people's photographs, but I'm taking my own and I'm putting them in my books. And I like to think that, you know, with time, maybe we're living in this digital dark age now where our digital files may be lost. And at least in my books, my photographs are there. And that maybe give it 100 years, the only, like, you know, photos of the 2020s might be rare, and my published photos may be some of the few left. Well, I guess we'll see. So yeah, that's something I've been happy about, is having my own
So Trevor,
photographs
just
and
a
stuff.
quick question for you. When you decide, okay, I'm going to take a now photo of this particular spot, like, how long do you have to wait for the moment to take the picture? Do you have to wait a long time, or sometimes it depend on the location? How does that work?
Oh, that's a great question. It definitely changes with the spot, but I'm finding with Toronto, the traffic is relentless. So some spots where I thought, oh yeah, this will be easy, I just need to snap a quick shot. You know, some of my comparisons don't need a bus or a streetcar in the now shot. So I think, oh yeah, I'll just go up to the spot, take the photo, and it'll be good. But then the traffic is just so relentless that sometimes I end up waiting a long, long time. But I also feel like the longer I wait, the more dedicated I feel that, well, I've already stood here for an hour. I can't leave now. And one particular spot that comes to mind is Davenport. There was this old bus loop where the toll keeper's cottage is now. And so doing a comparison, I thought, oh, okay, I'm just taking a picture of a building from across the street. That should be easy, right? Then I get there and the traffic would just not give up. And it took like an hour until finally there was a break and I got the shot. But yeah, it can take quite a long time to do this. But you know, it's a passion project, so I'm happy to do it. But yeah, it can take quite some time.
What about you, Rob? What's your favorite part of the book? Or Any themes that you wanted to talk
Well,
about?
themes. So the one theme that kind of came kind of coalesced, if you will, as I finished the book was, I remember, reading the early TDC pamphlets that came out in the 80s and talked about how the G trains were built overweight and they were way heavier than expected. But there's never any explanation of how this happened. Like, how did this actually happen? Why did this happen? So in exploring, kind of how the cars were designed, and there's the initial plan for the TTC to build rapid transit cars, kind of based on the PCC streetcar, kind of like the Chicago L cars or the early Cleveland rapid transit cars, using that streetcar technology and like a square body, so like car 48 at the museum. But then, of course, the Korean War comes in, and then there's the cost and the builders, the Canadian builders quoting high costs, and the TTC, being run by frugal Scotsmen, didn't want to pay big money, so they looked for anywhere they could save a dollar or two. So naturally, they went hunting around to see if they could find builders who could build a car for less. And they went to Europe, they went to the UK, and the TTC's general manager, Mr. Duncan, being the top level frugal Scotsman of the TTC, said, "I like these guys. They know how to build subway cars, and they can build them for a good price." They built cars in London. They were like very good quality, high quality cars. And of course, and when the TDC ended up awarding the contract to Gloucester, and of course Gloucester couldn't build a PCC car because they didn't have the technology, because PCC cars have specific trucks that make them PCC cars and specific types of high speed motors and things. Well, Gloucester didn't have access to that because they were building cars for London. So what they ended up doing is, we're going to substitute our trucks that we use for these London cars, and we're going to substitute the gearbox that we used on these London cars. So as the design was evolving, they kept substituting parts and changing things, and the TTC was like, "Okay, yeah, that's good, because the number one thing that kind of popped into my mind, is just as I was finishing the book, was that these cars were being built to a deadline. So the TTC had a firm deadline. They wanted, so the chairman, Mr. McBrien, the hard line guy, he said, "I want the subway open by March of 1954 at the latest." So for him, it was a matter of personal pride. He was also ill with cancer, and I think that kind of played into it. He wanted it finished before he died. And so he laid down the law that the subway is going to open by March of 1954, and we've got to have those cars before that date. So Gloucester and the TTC were like scrambling to get a car design built and to build the cars and have them ready in time for the subway. Now, compare this to what's going on today with the Eglinton LRT, which has turned into like a huge joke, because it was supposed to open in 2020, and here we are almost in the middle of 2025, and we still don't know when it's going to open. So a sharp, I found this theme that, it was a sharp contrast to today, where, those cars were built to a firm deadline because someone decided that this is the deadline date, and it's it's a matter of my personal pride and honor to get the subway open by this date. And that contributed to how the cars ended up being over it, because so many changes were being made, nobody was keeping track of anything. So if it had been more like a timeline like today, they might have said, "Okay, well, we can't build this car, so let's revisit the specs and let's revisit the design and see what it'll look like if we substitute different components for what was in the original design, and then see what the design looks like. It'll be a heavier car, but at least then they would know about it," as opposed to what happened, which was they expected the car to weigh like 62,000 pounds. They rolled the finished car onto the scale, and it pops out at 83,000. It's like, whoa, like what happened, right? So, and that was because nobody was managing it. And so that to me came up as the theme, is like, well, this was how this happened. And it's a sharp contrast to what kind of is going on, kind of in transit projects today, where things are routinely delayed and pushed back, and on and on for, unfortunately, the Eglinton LRT is the worst example of this, because it just goes on for years. So that I found was kind of an interesting theme of how the cars were developed, was that it was just this sort of mad rush to a deadline, which is something that's unheard of today. In terms of my favorite part, which oddly enough was the retirement of the cars in like the late 1980s and early 1990s, because that really, for me, that was being able to draw on my own recollections of riding those trains and like tracking the last trains and when was the last day these cars ran, because I had actually done all that myself, and so I was able to write a lot of that section just based on my own personal memories of doing that back in 1989 and 1990. So that part was kind of the most, well, kind of my favorite, because it was just all from my own notes and recollections rather than, kind of going from historical documents. So yeah, ironically, the part where the cars are retired was my favorite part to write. But yeah, so it was kind of neat to be able to let you use all the notes and things that I had accumulated chasing the trains around years before, to actually incorporate into the book. So yeah.
I think for me, like my overall theme was, especially for the 70th too, is the focus on the members, because the museum, wouldn't be here without the people who built it and the people who keep it running, for 70 years. So that was kind of my overarching theme of the book. And then with each chapter, I tried to pull out a small short phrase or a one word for each chapter that sort of talked about what that chapter meant in the history. What surprised me the most was how many, like, because I pulled all the content from the newsletters from the beginning to present day, and then a bit from annual reports too. Was yes, there's lots of story and history about the museum, but there's also within that the arc of members and their stories. You see moments of people when they started and when they got involved, like when they joined, to present day, or they've sadly passed away. But for me, I thought that was really interesting to see how people, how they get involved. They get involved, and then they become really involved or whatever. It's really interesting. And I'm a genealogist as well, so it's, genealogy is this, people think of it as, okay, there's a birth date and there's a death date and that's it, like that's your story. But so this is nice to see that you get a bit of a story about someone's life. This was a big part of a lot of our lives as members. So anyway, so Rob, there's a couple of questions here for you.
Yeah.
One is, were the G cars, were they completely built in the UK, or was there any part that was built in Canada, or did they arrive in Canada completely like ready to go?
Yeah, they were built like 100% completely in the UK. And as I alluded, like, the TDC had come up with this sort of PCC car design, and the Gloucester kind of had built the I guess the R stock in London from 1949 was the most recent. And the Gloucester cars are kind of like the fusion of these two ideas, taking the body design of the PCC car, but all the mechanical equipment from the London R stock, and kind of like merged together. So the cars were built entirely in the UK and shipped complete. And basically, when they arrived, they put the batteries in them and got them running and did the final testing on them, and they were ready to go. So.
Second question. So based on what you were saying, Rob, about the cars being built to a deadline, what might that mean for the unknown opening date of Line 5 and Line 5's train cars?
Well, this is where it comes down to, I think at some point, someone needs to put a deadline on things, because otherwise, there's always something to be fixed. There's always something to be adjusted. There's always something to be further tested. I mean, I don't know if Trevor, if you had gone out and taken pictures along Eglinton back when the construction started, those will be pretty much almost archival photos by now.
Yeah.
When the LRT line's opening, right? Because it's like 2010 or 2011 when construction started. So I think at some point, yeah, someone has to kind of put a deadline into place to say, okay, let's make this happen and let's get it done, because otherwise, yeah, the things can just drag on and on and on. So I mean, the G trains were kind of an extreme example of having a deadline that was probably unrealistic, because someone set it arbitrarily. But the Eglinton LRT and to lesser extent Finch, but mostly Eglinton is just not, you could just go on forever. You could keep finding things to fix and never open it. So I think, at some point someone's got to put a line in the calendar and say, okay, this is it, like have this done by this date.
There's another question here for all three of us. Do you do all of the editing yourself, or do you send it to an editor, like a professional editor, or a friend or a family member? Like how does that process work for you in the editing phase?
Well, I've done most of the compilation of my books. I was using Adobe, what's it called? InDesign. So yeah, I did most of the work on compiling my first books, and then I'd get some more experts to proofread them. But for the most part, I did all the work on my books, putting them together, editing all the photos, and yeah, it's quite a lot of work.
So what about you, Rob? Did you have anyone read over your
Yeah,
drafts?
absolutely. So I had so I in the course of trying to source out information, I made contact with a retired subway operator who was coincidentally just as big of a fanatic of the G trains as I am. And sadly, he passed away before the book was published. But he had photographed everything, like every car, inside, outside, back end, front end, under, like the numbers, everything. And he was able to help with writing a lot of the details, on how the operations worked at the Davisville yard and I actually have a whole section of, his experience of operating a G train, on the whole line from end to end, both directions. So having someone who actually, operated the cars and worked on them and was, equally interested in them, and who worked on them, being able to proofread a lot of the information was really, really valuable. In terms of the overall book, I mean, there were a couple of people who did some proofing. Ted Wixon actually did a sort of an initial read on it, and for some style points, and then Chris Prentice of the Canadian Transit Heritage Foundation, he did a review, kind of like a text review and some edit suggestions, kind of having a second pair of eyes who haven't read the book in a million times after when you write it yourself. And then the third checker was my wife Tiffany, who actually went through having zero knowledge of the material and content, and maybe slightly more interest in the content than that. But she went through and actually verified that that chapter, where it says chapter 1 starts on page 43. Flipping through the book is chapter 1 actually starting on page 43? Is chapter 3 is appendix 12 appendix 12, making sure, like, just doing the mechanical review, simple things like just making sure that all the page references line up, that all the appendices in the table of contents are the actual numbers in the book. So that was very helpful too. And just just doing that review of not knowing the subject material, but making sure that basic things like like the page numbering and chapter headings and everything all matched up was very helpful too.
I have to agree with you. I had a similar experience with that, like getting someone to look at those details. She's actually used to be a professor at the University of Guelph, so she was a perfect person to look at that, and then just kind of did the final review for me. And then other sort of, I think, pieces I had people look at, and then myself and another person too. So there's been a few eyes on it. I will say though, and I do say that in the book, in terms of text, I tried not to change too much because I wanted it to be the voices of the people who actually wrote those articles in the newsletters. So some of it may not be perfectly correct or consistent, but there's a reason for that, and that's because but anyway, so I do talk about that in the beginning of the book. But yes, definitely those mechanical things are very important, making sure that the chapter starts on where it actually says in the table of contents and the footers are all correct and everything. So yeah, that's definitely important. And thank you to all of our editors for doing that and people who just check those things. So just want to move into the next sort of couple of questions here. And then I think we'll open up to the floor if there are any other questions. So in terms of like messages or goals, what do you hope readers will take away from your book, from looking at your photos, from reading, what you've written? But what do you hope that they take away? And have you had any feedback from anyone? Because you guys are both have your books out there. Have you heard anything from people what they enjoy about it?
Well, I mean, my goal has always been to entice like regular people into getting into transit history. So I never really set out to just make stuff that only hardcore transit enthusiasts like myself would enjoy. The goal was always to bring in regular people, and also to show them like there are spots they can visit themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the rail trails, there are spots of interests. And because I include them in my book, I actually hope to inspire people to go see them for themselves. This is a very interactive hobby. There's plenty of spots you can go and see and photograph for yourself. But again, it is mostly about trying to make this more accessible to a wider audience. And so I try to do that the best way I can, just have fun with photography and hope to inspire a whole new generation of transit enthusiasts.
But have you had any feedback, Trevor? Like, has anyone commented, oh, where'd you find that photo? Or I really love how you laid this out, or anything like that?
Honestly, not as much as I would like. I mean, I've
No.
gotten comments that, oh, your books were great, which is good. But I mean, I would love to get into depth more. People have questions, so not too many. But again, people seem to like what I'm doing. They really like the then and now comparisons aspect of it. So getting that feedback tells me that I'm on the right track here. And I mean, some people just request other cities. I mean, even you, Caroline, have asked about Guelph. Like, when's my
Yeah.
Guelph book? And like, I know I would love to. So slowly but surely, I mean, as I said, every city in the world has transit history, so I'll get there. It's just tough digging up stuff, especially as smaller cities. There's not as much to work with, but again, I'm always open to suggestions or constructive feedback. I'd love to hear it. Yeah, so any feedback is welcome.
What about you, Rob?
Well, I think similar to Travelers, it to try to make the story, the history of how these subway cars, the first subway cars were developed and how they kind of came to be, and the opening of the subway and kind of all the intrigue that personal stories and conflicts and everything else that kind of happened in the background is, and to write it in such a way that it's accessible to people who aren't hardcore transit fans. There are a lot of people out who love Toronto transit history. I mean, like Trevor, you see those friends of vintage Toronto Facebook groups. You post a picture of something, and I think some of your then and now photos have come on there, and the comments like just explode. Like people just go, "Oh, I remember that building. I remember this." And so people, there's a lot of common kind of memory out there, and I think the G trains, I mean, they're getting a little bit far back in the past now. It's been it'll be 35 years this year since the last train retired, but there's a lot of a lot of people out there who grew up in Toronto in the 1950s and 60s and remember riding the subway. And again, it was new. I mean, today people go, "Oh, the subway is it's always delayed. It's closed for construction." Well, but in the 50s and 60s, it was brand new. It was shiny, clean. It was fast. You weren't riding you weren't riding on a streetcar for an hour. You could be downtown in 20 minutes compared to like an hour and 15 minutes on the streetcar, right? So there was it was a big part of a lot of people growing up in Toronto, and a big part of the history of the city. And like I said, a lot of people, people every day travel to work and travel to school, to Maple Leafs hockey games, concerts, to see any like it was just part of daily, it was part of daily life. And and up at the museum on the days when we have like the Christmas events or busy days, people come walking through the G cars and like, oh, and it's, you'll get told, oh my God, yeah, I remember riding these every day to work. I remember the lights blinking on and off, and they were so hot in the summer. And it's kind of fun to hear that because people kind of walk through, and it brings back memories. I'm sure that their memories of going to work every day. The drudgery of daily work, probably not the greatest, but they come into the subway car and like, oh, it brings back a memory to them. Or the one lady who came in and she saw the poster for the opening of the Sky Dome, and she said, oh, I was in the choir that sang the opening of the Sky Dome when the roof didn't close and it rained on us. So it's kind of fun to hear all that history, the kind of the personal history that kind of goes with a lot, with transit vehicles. Because I mean, we see at the museum, we kind of see the vehicles, and we have visitors that come and ride them. But all these people, a lot of people have ridden these vehicles, particularly the more recent things like the CLRVs, which just retired like 5 years ago. And a lot of people have that sort of memory of riding these trains, and kind of brings them back to a time, a different time in their lives, maybe when they were teenagers and they go hang out and play pinball in an arcade on Yonge Street or something. So that's kind of just sort of bring that element in. But also there's the detail and everything that appeals to the transit fans. And I tried to pick a variety of photos that would appeal to kind of everyone, because people remember the subway stations as they appeared 30, 40 years ago, and kind of in their original look and how they look now. And just try to get a lot of photos in, to kind of people who rode the subway many years ago remember, oh, I remember those yellow tiles at Dundas Station, right? It's amazing. It's funny what people will come and comment on, and what kind of memories get triggered when people see the photo. So that's kind of the fun part of this, is just being able to integrate the history of Toronto, and people going about their lives in the subway.
So we have a few questions and comments here. So Trevor, one for you. It says, I don't have a question, but as a retired streetcar operator for quite a few years, I really enjoy your Transit Time Warp series. So,
Great.
so there's a comment for you. Also, someone is asking how they can share feedback with you, Trevor.
Yeah, I see that here. And I guess on my Facebook page would be great. In fact, I kind of wanted to mention something because Rob brought up a good point about so much of the feedback does come through Facebook posts. Now, as I said before, I haven't seen a ton of feedback on the books themselves that I've made, but yeah, I've seen tons and tons of feedback on the Facebook posts. And that's the thing, I guess that's something I kind of miss. When I pivoted away from posting all my comparisons on social media because I wanted people to purchase my books. I even had some personal people I know say to me, why would they buy my books if I dump it all on Facebook? I'm like, well, that's a great point. So kind of pivoted towards, just promoting my books. But definitely when I was posting my comparisons, I'd see so many comments of people talking about this stuff. As Rob said, they talking about the flickering lights and the G cars and stuff like that. Some people would mention that they remember coal stoves in the old wits or the wooden cars. So that's kind of thing that actually really amazed me. It was some of these Facebook comments, people talking about the 40s. I remember I posted a picture of the North Young car, number 416 that we've got. And some man said, oh yeah, I rode that thing up Young Street in the 1940s. And I'm like, whoa, this guy's on Facebook. Like, this is great. Like the kind of personal history you get. So there has been quite a bit of feedback. And yeah, if you do want to leave a review on my book at the moment, please do it on Facebook where people can see it. I don't have a website at the moment anymore. I mean, I'm sure I will again eventually. But yeah, Facebook will be the best place right now for that.
In person is always appreciated as well, right?
Yeah. Again, I'm always happy for constructive feedback if there's things that could be improved. One thing I didn't point out earlier too, like the challenge of these books was that, I was making Facebook posts. So it's photos and then there's like a bare minimum caption of, well, here's the info for the photo. Once I started making books, I realized, well, I know I actually have to write, like a writer. And so that was a big challenge, kind of, padding up my books as best I can. And that's something I'm still working on. I never really refer to myself as a writer. I'm a photographer who also writes captions. Yeah, it's been a great learning experience for me.
I think this question is for you, Robin. I'll try and get through it. It's a long one. Do you see a difference between transit history and transit heritage, if at all? And similarly, how do you reckon with the changing or aging transit landscape, i.e. processing what's lost in the closure of Line 3 or the demolition of Warden, among other things?
That is a good question.
The detailed question.
Transit history obviously is the passing of time. Today's transit is tomorrow's transit. Historical transit, and a lot of the history. Time passes, and things. Vehicles come and go. New vehicles arrive, older vehicles retire, and things pass away. And I think to the heritage aspect, I think it's always worthwhile to preserve some element of the history. And we can't save it all. We'd all love to we'd all like to save a specimen of every single type of streetcar or subway car or bus or trolley bus or whatever, but physically you can't do that because there's just too much. And I think so a lot of it I think is being able to preserve key elements, and being able to preserve vehicles that were significant or important, like the G cars. The first subway cars in Canada, or the M cars, the first Canadian built subway cars, or the Peter Witt car, which really turned around Toronto Transit in the 1920s. It was a brand new streetcar. We look at it today and it's 100 years old and it's sort of quaint, but at the time it was a big improvement over the old wooden cars that were running. So I think it's definitely worthwhile to preserve key vehicles. In terms of buildings and structures, I think it's a bit harder, but I think thanks to people like Trevor who are going out and photographing, going out and doing photographs. I think, Trevor, I don't know if you ever think about taking some photos that you're taking now that could be compared to something later, so you can almost do a then and now with your own photos. Like you could take photos of something that might change now, that might be gone. Like that's why I was kind of joking about taking photos along Eglinton. If you went out and took some photos along Eglinton today, well, 20 years from now, if the LRT line is extended, that'll be a change from, that'll be the then and now, but you could then use your own photos for both, right? So it's kind of interesting that way. You have to, you kind of have to think ahead, which, in doing a lot of transit history, we spend a lot of time looking back at historical photos and historical documents and things, and kind of, trying to interpret them to today. But I think a lot of what's captured today, and obviously, I mean, a lot of people are out today taking photos. I mean, people have phone cameras that are better than some good 35 millimeter cameras that were made 30 years ago, or even the digital cameras. The phone cameras are like fantastic. The number of photos being taken today is incredible. So it's capturing all that and using that to kind of document what we have today, because like it could be gone. I mean, the Scarborough RT, I mean, it was kind of, people knew that it was going to go, but it went quicker than everyone expected. So people didn't, I think a lot of people had in their minds that they were going to go for a last ride in October of 2024. Was it 24 or 23? I don't even remember now what year it went, but people probably had in mind that they were going to go for a last ride and take pictures, and then it closed abruptly before any people could do that. So, again, yeah, it's people didn't get an opportunity to go out and take their, document their, their last ride with this. So I think that's where it's important to, like take photos today, and even, photos of buildings, and not just, it's not just the vehicles, it's it's the buildings, the structures, those things, like, architecture, like the Bloor Danforth subway stations were all kind of built in a very similar uniform architectural style. And now, they've been renovating, they've been doing roof repairs, and now under safety, they got to put railings around the roof. The buildings are changing, they're being modified, and they don't all look the same anymore. So, even if for a simple project, just go out and take pictures of something, and that's, you've captured part of the history. So something that may disappear, it could be anything. It could be anything from a large building to even a small thing like the signs at the entrances to the subway stations. I mean, those have changed now. I think they're on like the fourth type of sign, and it's something that people don't really notice in the streetscape, right? So,
yeah, one thing actually, I've definitely considered what you've said, Rob. That maybe one day my photos will be the now photos. But another thing, if you're walking through the city, you'll see signs that say "Notice of Development." Where they're going to put up big condominiums. If I see a photo like that, my first thought is, maybe I should take pictures of this area, not just of that sign, but moving back of, well, here's the building I know they're going to demolish, because here's the sign. It shows you they're going to put up a 20-story tower in this intersection. Yeah, so there's been a few spots where I've gone around photographing that intersection because I saw that sign.
Well, and to your point, a lot of the photos in the Toronto archives, they would send the photographers out to photograph like the stores or the buildings on the street, knowing that was going to get demolished because they were going to extend a road, like the like when University Avenue was extended south of Queen, right? So they actually sent a photographer to take pictures of all the stores on that side of Queen Street that was going to get demolished. So in a sense, you're kind of doing what the archival photographers did 100 years ago, because someone say, "Oh, we better take photos of that before we demolish it." So they had the same idea.
So I have a comment here, sort of what you were saying. Completely agree, Rob. Mount Dennis, the new station, which was the Eastman Kodak factory. Before that was my family farm. So everything.
Oh, wow. There you go.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris Fox.
Yeah. And then another one, Trevor, someone's going to beat you to it, to the Eglinton to take some photos. So it's a race. And sorry, this next question leads into.
Sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Trevor,
I was gonna.
I noted, I did find when I was scanning through the Toronto Archives sort of undigitized collection. So remember that there's going to be the Eglinton West subway, which they did the groundbreaking and dug a hole in 1994, and then Mike Harris came along in 1995 and canceled it. But the TTC, the city did send a photographer out to go along Eglinton and photograph the streetscape before the subway. So there's actually a whole series of photos taken along Eglinton West, documenting what the streetscape looked like before the impending subway that never happened. So it's kind of interesting. So they actually went out and photographed. So there's a whole series of these streetscape photos from 1994, which are now 30 years old. which is kind of interesting because they would be very, well, they're archival now.
So the next
So
question leads into my final official question, I guess. It's this one's asking you, Rob, what your next project
next
is.
project, well,
It's gonna ask it for all of them, but yeah.
well, so looking at the G trains as the first subway cars of Toronto. I I went to the open house at the TTC's Greenwood shops and chatted with a fellow who worked on the T1 subway cars, which were built in I guess starting in 1995. And he did a lot of, he was heavily involved with the design and the testing of those cars. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of an interesting project because the T1 cars now, I mean, now obviously they're the older cars and their replacements seem likely probably within the next 10 years. It'd be interesting to write about the history of those because they're kind of the last of the old generation of subway cars, the married pairs and the single cars. So I thought that could be an interesting project. And another one that I thought about was there's the great book, The 50 Years of Progressive Transit, by John F. Bromley and Jack May, that kind of covered the TTC from 1921 to kind of 1971 from the electric transit standpoint. And I thought it would be kind of fun to do, with the TTC's 100th anniversary a few years ago, kind of like, well, so what would happen if you did the next 50 years? And kind of covered a lot of, in the same style and the same sort of, not getting too heavily in depth in politics and things, but kind of doing the same historical coverage. And a lot has happened. And I thought that might be kind of a fun project. And I did sort of, scribble down some notes and I put them somewhere safe and I can't find them right now, but I thought that would be kind of
Too
a
safe.
fun project to look at as well, just to kind of say, okay, that was a great book. And, what would happen if we rolled it forward another 50 years? So
I think that's a great title, The Next 50
the
or
next
something
50.
like that. What about you, Trevor, for next projects that you're tackling or hoping to tackle?
Well, I've got a few books in the works. Now, the thing is, I don't want to make any promises I can't keep. Again, it comes down to the research. If I never get enough material to justify a book, then it's not going to happen. However, it's seeming like as of now, my next book will be Toronto's Lost Streetcar Routes, which include the radials. It'd be a bit of everything, again, because I'm doing the whole photography first. I'm not going to go super in depth. I'm not going to make a Bible, like Rob made about the G cars. As great as it is, I kind of do. I'm more do a sampling of a little bit of everything. But I'm also really hoping to do a book on Niagara Falls transit history, which would be buses and the NS&T within Niagara Falls. So again, it's coming along nicely, but it is hard to get photos. As I get away from Toronto, it becomes rarer to get some of these shots. But I'm still gonna, I'm determined, so I'm gonna keep holding out, seeing what I can dig up. So yeah, there's Toronto's Lost Streetcar Routes, Niagara Falls Transit, Kitchener Transit. That'd be good. Well, Kitchener Waterloo. I think there's a lot to be covered in that. And something maybe more like Niagara Falls and Kitchener, I will go more into depth about, because there also hasn't been a book about Niagara Falls transit history. Yeah, there's been a book about the NS&T. There's a great one by John Mills, but from what I've seen, nobody's just done the history of that city's transit system. So definitely be more in depth. I would love to do on Guelph as requested by one of my fans, but again, it comes down to what photographs I can actually dig up on this stuff. It gets harder and harder, but I'm also networking. I'm meeting fellow photographers, so I have faith that I will be able to find more. See, I'm even thinking that maybe one day I'll do a whole book on just the Toronto Suburban Railway, which is a niche. Again, like I don't expect that one to be huge, but again, that's the line our museum is built on. And I've even recently I've got a whole bunch of photographs from guys like John Knight and Robert Sandusky. And I also know that the Ontario Hydro Archives is out there. It's not accessible
Somewhere.
at the moment. It might be at the Ontario Archives, but even they don't seem to know they have it. So in my mind, it's like, well, one day I might get access to that. And if I have all of that, well, all the possibilities, all the books I can make with that content. But until I actually have it, I can't make any promises. But that's the way I'm thinking about it. Again, it's about collecting the photographs. And because I buy them off eBay, you never know, it might pop up next week. That shot I've been hoping for. Oh, there it is. Oh, I'll just pay $50 off eBay. That's not cheap. But again, that is kind of how this happens. But I'm also realizing I want to just create my own artwork. So I've started working on a comic book, a transit time warp comic book. I don't want to spoil too much what it will be about. But again, in my mind, it's the idea that I'm just creating the artwork from scratch. I won't have to depend on archival photographs or anyone's photographs. if I'm just creating the artwork myself, and heck, maybe if the comic book series is a big success, maybe it'll pay for me to go to more archives and digitize that stuff and pay for archival material. So we'll see. Again, not making any promises, but there's a ton of stuff I want to put out in the future. So we'll see what happens.
Question for you here, Trevor. Do you think Norfolk County has enough info for a second volume?
Well, it depends on which one. So far, every book I've released is volume 1, because again, they're photography series. I want to be able to revisit every city. So yeah, the Halton County, our museum does have lots of information and in its archives. But again, I guess, more of the rarer stuff I'd want to get into. I already know we don't have, if I want to do like a Hamilton Transit Volume 2, I feel like I've already kind of used some of the good stuff from our museum's archives. So moving forward, I think this is going to become a much harder thing to research. Maybe some of the best stuff is in people's private collections and not in archives and museums. So perhaps the future of this is me networking with fellow photographers like I've been doing already, but I feel like I'm going to have to keep doing more and more of that. I don't know if our museum's archives is necessarily the future to my book series.
For me, the next project's I'm going to redo our museum brochure. It's been a few years. I'm trying to remember the other day, at least 15 years. So that one needs a revamp. And then the guidebook needs to be updated. So I will be reaching out to people that help with that, probably you guys, for pictures and history and that kind of stuff. But those will be mine. And I guess sort of as on a personal note, I've been working on a fictional story, not to do with transit though. So, but it's kind of an on and off as I get inspired and have time, mostly inspired. But anyway, so lots going on for sure. And looking forward to redoing the brochure and that, and because it's grossly overdue. Another question
Oh, sorry,
here.
one quick thing. Sorry, I misunderstood
Yeah.
Sam's question because I'm reading it now. He said Norfolk County. Yeah,
Yes.
so
Oh, yeah.
that's because
Sorry,
of my book,
Norfolk.
Grand River and Lake Erie Electric Railways. Yes, I think there is enough for a volume 2. Again, I did make it volume 1, so I have kind of promised there will be a volume 2. And yeah, I think there is more content, and I've already dug up quite a few old photographs that weren't in my first book, so I think there'll always be space for a volume 2. The real question is, will there be a volume 3? That would
So, well, and Trevor, maybe you could do like a small cities book, just compile, Guelph and whatever else. I'm still putting Guelph in there.
I know, and
Anyway.
it goes on my to-do list, but I'm going to need a lot more photos to make that happen. So hopefully they're out there. We'll see.
Um, yeah, hopefully. So another question, how is credit given when you get an archive historic photo to use in your book? So Rob, this probably applies to you as well. If it's still copyrighted. So like how does that work for crediting archival photos or
Well,
any photos that aren't yours, I guess.
yeah,
So
in the case of the Toronto archives, I did use about a half dozen photos from the Toronto archives, and then a number of photos from the Gloucestershire archives, and basically the Toronto archive TTC collections are basically public domain. They're not under any copyright restriction, so their only requirement was, please list the full citation of the photograph series, the file, like the full detail of where, the photo catalog ID. And the Gloucestershire archives was the same thing. Here's the full reference number of this photograph. As long as you reproduce it in full and you give us credit, we're happy. In terms of private photographers, photos that I've acquired, obviously, if like Trevor says, you get slides and photos on eBay. A lot of them arrive with no name on them, nothing written other than Toronto.
Yeah.
That's all that's written on the slide. So you have no idea whose photo it is. So you obviously put as, photographer unknown, and with under your own collection. But in terms of photographers that I used photos from, it was just um, I think different from an academic work where you want to write letters and make sure you get clearances for copyright usage. It can be a very, very formal exercise. I mean, really, for the photographers, for the most part, for photos where I used, multiple images. It was just a case of, sending them an email saying, I'd like to use your photos in this book. Here's how I'll credit your, here's how I'm proposing to credit it. And they're like, yep, sounds good. Fine with me. Thanks for using my photos. Glad you could use them. And yeah, it was pretty straightforward. So.
What about you, Trevor? What's your experience with using archival photos?
Yeah, usually the archives tells you how they want you to citate it, which is no problem. And again, I'm happy to credit. A lot of them have come down to, collection of Trevor Parkins-Sciberras. As Rob mentioned, a lot of these slides you buy off eBay don't have the names on them, unfortunately. Now, I have found by showing fellow collectors the slide itself, they recognize the handwriting on the slide and they've actually will tell me who took that photograph. So that's been helpful. Yeah. I'd always would love to know who the photographer is. Sometimes you put unknown photographer, you don't know. But then I put it on Facebook and I have people asking me on Facebook, oh, who took that photo? And I wish I knew. But a lot of these slides don't have the names on them. But again, with archives, they tell you how to credit them. So that's been good.
Just seeing if there's any other questions. There's a comment. Thank you for all this informative talk, and good luck on all your future endeavors. I'll give it another minute or so, see if any other questions come in. Oh,
Questions,
good things.
comments,
Archives tell you how to credit them.
Smart remarks.
Smart remarks. I have a couple of questions that I'll just sort of follow up with that in case we had time. Is there anything that didn't make it in your book or books that you wish that you had have put in now that it's been published in that? And Trevor, you have an opportunity to do volume 2, so that's a good a good way to do it. But Rob, was there anything in your book that you took out and
there was. So there's a short section. There was a kind of a big blow up in the TTC between the former Toronto Mayor Alan Lamport, who was mayor of Toronto in kind of the early 1950s and became TTC commissioner, and Mr. Duncan, the general manager, the fellow I mentioned earlier, about the Gloucester subway cars. And then, Mr. Lamport, think Rob Ford in terms of, being a troublemaker and a person who, getting on everybody's nerves. But he kind of went out and says, well, why were these cars overweight? Why, I want a full investigation. And so I think this was like front page newspaper material for like weeks in 1959. And in the TTC minutes, there's like reams and reams of like all the charges that Lamport leveled against Duncan for like negligence and not reporting this and not following that and not doing this. And we should be suing Gloucester. And it was kind of amusing isn't the word. It was kind of entertaining because Alan Lamport was kind of a colorful character, and he's like banging his fist. His descriptions of him banging his fist on the table at meetings and going on about everything. And initially, I think I had about maybe like 10 pages of kind of how this story evolved and how it was resolved. And I had 2 or 3 people review it and say, that's too much. That's too long. And you could probably condense that down to like 2 or 3 pages, and that's what I ended up going with, because he said you could almost do that as a standalone little mini story. Because it's conflict, conflict of people, and strong-willed men kind of butting heads and getting into a fight. But he thought they said, well, it's not really super relevant to the story of the subway cars. It kind of is, but it isn't, because it doesn't really relate to them specifically, and it kind of detracts from kind of other things. So that I really reduced the amount that I had written on that, but I still thought it was kind of an interesting story, because it was the kind of thing that pre social media, where things come and go in the news every day. Like this was kind of the kind of thing that was in the news for like 3 months. It kind of went on every single day in the paper. It was like front page news, and newspaper columnists were writing about it, and it was like a huge thing and at the time. So but in looking back on it, yeah, it was probably the right decision to trim it down in terms of the book itself. But as a separate standalone story, it'd be kind of an entertaining standalone piece.
What about you, Trevor? Is there anything that you didn't put in that maybe you're planning on, or that you regret that you didn't?
Well, as you did point out, yeah, thankfully I'm doing volume 2s. So
Yeah.
I can always get that second chance to pack stuff in. But I will say that when I got to my second and third books, I started adding in the rail trails and surviving artifacts, but that's not something I put in the first book, which is Toronto's transit. My first book was definitely the shortest, where it was strictly the then and now. And then once I started moving on to the other books, I was like, well, there's a lot of history that people wouldn't know, and so here's some more additional information. So then looking back, I felt, well, now my first book seems kind of undercooked. Maybe I could have added more. Thankfully, I always get that chance to go back and revisit it. But also, I've realized, well, if I'm going to do a Toronto's Lost Streetcar Routes book, that can include a lot of stuff that maybe I thought I should have included in my original Toronto Transit book. I also just have a lot of comparisons. I had to pick and choose. Well, which ones am I going to put in this book? Only the best ones. But man, I've made so many. I've made like 400 of those then and now comparisons over the last 5 years, and each book only has about 30, less than that. So there's so many that I wanted to put in, and I had to pick and choose which ones are the best. And as I mentioned, as I got into the later books, more of the rail trails and the surviving artifacts, especially if they're vehicles that are at our museum. I love giving a shout out to that. So, but again, these are things that I can always put into volume 2, thankfully. So, yeah.
Trevor, here's a tip for you. Cornwall. So Cornwall, of course, had the electric railway and the trolley buses.
Yes.
I'm told that some of those loops from those trolley buses still exist, and some of the actual metal poles are still in place for where the trolley buses like looped, like they're still there. Like the loop is still there. It's now like a little parquet or something, but the metal poles from the overhead wires are still in place. It's sort of like sort of stuck in time. But that's kind of if you're ever in that area, check out Cornwall. Lots of transit history there. Obviously, the electric railway, the trolley buses, streetcars. So kind of a different, Eastern Ontario, sort of a little different area. But yeah, that's the one to check out, because it's sort of there's still some artifacts around that you can track down.
So there's a question in the Q&A here. What things or places do you think might stand out to future archaeologists if they excavated parts of the TTC?
The unfinished subway stations. There's a couple of those, aren't there?
Yeah, the lower Queens. Well, the lower Queen station, I wonder if it's going to get obliterated with the Ontario line construction going around there, because it was basically a hollowed out LRT station, really. And the TTC, in fact, infringed on some of it when they made the subway station accessible, because they put the elevators in on each side and they made a wide corridor which kind of went into the empty space of where the unfinished station was. He said, oh, this is great, we've got this empty space we can use to make a wide hallway, right? I think that would be kind of interesting. Other than that, I think, I mean something like even like the Greenwood Yard, I mean, when it was built on an old landfill site which had previously been a brickyard originally, and then once the brickyard was kind of exhausted, it was kind of used as a dump. And 100 years ago you could have a landfill because everything was organic or glass or whatever. So there, even when they were building the yard, they were finding all kinds of old glass bottles and artifacts. So I think it'd be kind of interesting if you actually did a dig through under the Greenwood subway yard. You'd probably find a lot of neat old 100-year-old like glass bottles and artifacts, and those seem to turn up a lot in Toronto wherever land has been filled. So that's kind of one I think would be kind of fun.
Yeah, definitely anything underground I think could stand the test of time. But anything street level gets ripped up. They take out streetcar tracks, they repave the road. That stuff can get lost with time, but maybe something underground will last.
So it's just Justin seems to be inspired. He said he should ask his grandmother about her photographic collection. So anyway, so that's good that we were.
And you never know, because people used to go around and take pictures of Toronto, and I had a piano teacher that had like a whole wall full of slide carousels, and it was all like Toronto photos, and it was like from the 1950s to the 1980s. And I actually, like years later, asked about them because I thought it's kind of interesting. I wonder if there's any transit photos. He says, no, a lot of they all faded out. We threw like 80% of them away because the slides had like completely faded out. And I'm like, like if you scan them, you could probably restore the images.
Fix that.
Yeah, you could have fixed that. So they said,
can be fixed.
Yeah, we kept the good ones, which were probably the Kodachrome slides. But I always thought that was intriguing because it was like Toronto and people, like 1956, Toronto people, 1957. I've ever seen these boxes on the wall, and I thought, you never know what's in there. Like what kind of treasure, because people who are non-transit photographers and who are interested in, in the city and Toronto, and in the course of doing things, they just take photos of, if they're doing a family picnic or something on the island or wherever, there's things in the background that kind of are captured at that moment, and everybody has sort of a different angle on what they're taking a photo of. Like, they might have taken a photo of their family with the skyline in the background. Well, like there's a neat photo right there. So you never know what kind of treasures are out there. And hopefully, I think now, people are aware more of, more of the history, and it's not, oh, well, grandpa's old slides, let's just throw them all in the dumpster. It's like, no, don't do that. Don't do
Yeah, it
that.
is kind of
There's a
sad
lot
that
of
that.
that. I mean, who knows how much was lost? I mean, who knows how many photographs were lost? But I think people have a better awareness now that old photographs can be, digitized and restored and preserved. And obviously, family photos are more of interest to the family, if they're specifically of people. But a lot of people would go out and take pictures of the city. I mean, a lot changed in Toronto between like 1950 and 1980 or 1990. So, we think of the downtown, but in terms of outside of the downtown, I mean, a lot of the what we think of now as the sort of major thoroughfares of Toronto, like Shepherd or Finch, were like two lane country roads in like 1955 and 1965. They're big four lane roads. So like there was a huge construction boom in the suburban parts of Toronto, and who knows what kind of photos are out there somewhere. So maybe Trevor will find them if he networks with the right people. These things may come to light. Now that would be fantastic.
Yeah, hopefully.
So someone's made a comment to just sort of generally about, you mentioned that the photos, we don't even know who the photographers are. We don't even know if the photographers are still living, and that. So it's not only the photos themselves, it's the people who take them too,
Yep.
that we kind of lose that history as well. I know I've seen on Facebook a little bit, there's some groups that'll post photos from a certain area or whatever, and be like, oh, does anyone know about this? Can you tell me about this photo, or who's in this photo, or stuff like that. So it is nice to see that there is that, and people are finding some answers, maybe not all the time, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say, I feel like
Sorry.
if the photo collections are being sold off on eBay one at a time, I feel like
Mhm.
that's a good chance that the photographer is not alive anymore.
Yeah.
A lot of these collectors, they get the collections and then another one's selling it off, and if they haven't credited the photographer, maybe they don't even know. So
Yeah.
that's the thing.
Sometimes they don't know, and I've asked, because I said, whose collection this came from. They're like, no, somebody was selling it, and
Mhm.
the photographer's family. I didn't buy it from the photographer's family. I bought it from an intermediary, so I don't even know whose these are. Um,
Mhm.
but in some cases, I've asked, and they said, "Oh yeah, I saw a name on the box. It was this." I'm like, "Oh great," because then now I know if I get some slides, I can write that person's name on those slides, and at least they get credit. So, and I obviously, to that end, labeling. I've shot slides since 1990, and I'm still shooting slides. I think I'm on my 1,737th roll of slides since 1990. And the importance of labeling, like labeling is so key. You get slides back, the first thing is labeled. And I'm guilty as all these people on eBay not putting my name on the slides. So now when I pull out old slides to look at or scan, I write my name on them. So that gradually, eventually, over time, I'll probably get have my name written on all of them, because yeah, you never know. Somebody look at them and say, "Oh, this looks like a Rob Lubinski slide, is it?" But it doesn't have any writing on it. We don't know.
Mhm.
So in terms of analog photography, like photo prints and slides, if you're taking photos, write your name on them. On the back of your
Yeah.
photos or on your slides. Or get a little stamp. I know it's it's kind of a bit tedious to stamp slides over and over, but if you do, if you have a collection, do what you can to label it, because at least in that way your name is on the photo. And if somebody uses the photo, if Trevor has a great photo for then and now, like your name can you'll get recognized for your original photo. Otherwise you're just an unknown photographer. So I think that's I think we don't think about a lot of that, because at the time we're taking the photos and we don't think about labeling and putting our name on them, but it's very important.
Just a comment in here. Someone said, I think a YouTuber I follow, I remember him posting a video around Woodbine Station. There are some remaining traces of abandoned streetcar
Yeah.
tracks. So,
Yes,
yeah.
I think there's
Yeah,
some track on.
Strathmore Boulevard behind the station.
Yeah, and then there's actually some track on Danforth that's come out of the road at
Okay.
Woodbine, and there's track a little further west. at Hillingdon Avenue, there's a switch where it went into the old Danforth car house. That piece of track is actually coming right out of the pavement, like the actual, not the switch side, but the split, the other side of the track is actually like the track is like right out of the pavement. So the city's been kind of slack on slapping asphalt on top. And I think there's some track on like North Upper Young Street even that's come out of the road. So there's a lot of track still buried. And as long as the road is in good shape, they just slap more asphalt on top of it, unless they do like a total rebuild. In which case then they tear it all out. But I was amazed. I was amazed in like 1999 they tore up Young Street around the Beltline Bridge. And I thought, all the tracks on Young Street are all gone. Well, lo and behold, they rip up the road, and what's under there? All the ties. So they took the track out. They took the track and all the granite blocks out, but left all the ties in. So here they are in 1999. So 40 years later, 45 years later, after the streetcars are gone, tearing up the road, and all the ties were still in the road. There's like a big heap of rotten ties where they dug them all out. I thought, well, that's kind of neat. I wouldn't have thought of that. They're still there.
So I'm going to close the question. Sorry, I'm just going to close off the questions now and just open it up if you guys have any final remarks or closing remarks anything that you want to say that you didn't get to say.
Well, one quick thing just about the tracks behind Woodbine Station. What's interesting is that they never seem to have been buried.
No.
Because they've always been there on Strathmore Boulevard for the last 50 years. I believe they're only used from 1966 to 1968. It's kind of crazy. And all those years since, they've been sitting there exposed.
I fell on my bike. Right? I fell on my bike. My bike wheel got caught in them once, and I wiped out on them.
Really? Eh?
But they were in the borough of East York before the amalgamation of Toronto. That little bit of track was in the old, and the borough of East York was notoriously short of money, like the borough of York. So they didn't spend a lot of money on repaving roads. And that road obviously had been built in 1966 when they put the track in. So it was still in good shape. So they just left it alone. The tracks, they just left the track there. So that's kind of how that survived. I think it's shortened now from what it was like even 30 years ago. But I think it's because it was still a good, like fairly new road at the time. And why repave it? Just leave it alone. It costs money to repave it.
Well, we're coming up on 8:30, so I just want to, I guess I'll close it off there and just thank you, Rob and Trevor, for your discussion tonight. It's been really great to hear about your projects. It's always, I always find it interesting to hear the backstory of what it takes to put these together. I mean, you see these things in lovely bookstores and whatnot, and so it's nice to hear that. So I think we've all got a lot of great insight and looking forward to future things. I know I'm not the only one based on the comments here. So for our audience, just a final note, if you're looking to purchase any of these books, they are available in the gift shop at the museum. We are also working on putting on an online store on the website for the museum too. And I know Trevor, with yours, actually yours too, Rob, there's other places online where you can buy your books too. So lots of options. I think the price is the same, I believe, where you go. But anyway, you can shop around. But yeah, so that's really great. And then if you see Rob and Trevor, you can ask them for their autograph. The 70th book, I am sending it to print probably tomorrow, so I'm really excited. But it should be available, I'm going to guess maybe in 3 to 4 weeks. So it will be available in the gift shop, and also working on putting it online too. So stay tuned on that one. I think for the members and that, for anyone on here, we have our opening day this Saturday, so it was kind of great that we could do this as, I guess, a kickoff to opening on Saturday, and we'll be open 5 days a week in July and August. So looking forward to welcoming everyone to the museum and selling these awesome books and everything. So if anyone has any further questions, you can send them to streetcar@hcry.org. And we'll redirect them to whoever you're asking the question if you don't know how to contact them in any other way. So just again, a big thanks to Rob and Trevor for coming out. I really appreciate you spending the time talking with me and with everyone else here. And thank you everyone for all your questions. It was really great to engage. And then finally, thank you, Spencer, so much for providing all of the administrative and technical support. We couldn't have done this without you. So really appreciate it. and coming up on 8:30 exactly. So perfect. Thanks,
Well, thanks for the
everyone.
opportunity, and
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
hope
you.
everyone enjoyed it. Thanks, thanks Caroline, thanks Spencer, thanks Trevor, and thanks to everyone who listened.
Awesome. Have a great
All right,
night,
have a great
everyone.
evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.